Thanks for joining this climate adaptation in the forest sector session. I'm Oliver Pierson. Since September, I've been the director for forests in the Vermont Department of Forest, Parks and Recreation. I'm really pleased to see all of you for this really important topic. Have three speakers today in about an hour and a half. We do have a bit of a competitive situation where Abby, who's facilitating the recreation session next door, said her session's better than ours. We're going to make more noise at some point to prove them wrong, so we'll get to that. But what we'll do is we're going to have three presentations, well, a little Q&A after each one for any sort of pressing topics, clarifications, or any questions you can't hold. But we'll try to get through all three of them to have, hopefully at least 20 minutes, if not more, at the end for a general discussion about this subject. So I'll start by introducing first presenter. We're very pleased to have Al Freeman with us. Al's currently the climate forester with Vermont FPR. She just joined FPR earlier this year, and she's also finishing up her PhD at the University of Vermont, where she's working on the intersection of adaptive silviculture, climate change, and ecophysiology in the Tony D'Amato's lab. Al's originally from Kansas. She holds a BS in biology from the University of Kansas and an MS in plant biology, ecology, and evolution from Oklahoma State University. And one of the reasons we hired her is she's not a botanist, but she plays one on TV. She's great plant ID skills in addition to all her climate knowledge. So for FPR, she serves as our technical expert on climate adaptation and forest carbon dynamics. She's following in Ali's shoes, so we expect some hard questions from Ali at the end of the presentation. And she's going to continue to advance our division's response to climate impacts on forest and forest management. In spare time, which we hope she has none of because she's always doing good work, Al can be found cross-country skiing and skating, kayaking those same waters in the summer with her partner and her dog, and she enjoys woodworking, home renovation, and by her own description, mediocre pottery. We're going to ask her to bring some in to confirm that. So without further ado, thanks very much for agreeing to present, Al.
And thanks everybody for coming. I know there's lots of good talks, so I'm excited that you're all here. As part of my role in the FPR, Oliver mentioned this, but I work with landowners and practitioners to help implement a climate change lens into our planning and forest management. And so for today's talk, I'm going to be outlining some of the climate threats that we're experiencing in our forest and forest operations, as well as some adaptation strategies. To start out, it's really important to discuss forest vulnerability. So what vulnerability is really the degree to which a system is susceptible to and unable to cope with adverse effects of climate change. So this includes climate variability. As you all know, it's not consistent across the landscape, as well as climate extremes. And so the vulnerability is really dependent on forest conditions, disturbances, and other stressors. And it's often broken into two parts. So we consider potential impacts and adaptive capacity when we're thinking of vulnerability. Really what we're looking at with potential impacts is how sensitive that system is to changes. So these are kind of the direct and indirect effects of climate change. Things like temperature, precipitation variability, species composition of the forest that you're working in, or stressors like pests and pathogens. So the big question really is, are those potential impacts likely to support or disrupt the health of that system? So for example, we're experiencing 3-degree warming in the summers. Are alpine forests more sensitive to that than an oak hickory forest? So considering what that forest composition is really important in looking at potential impacts. Then along with potential impacts, we consider adaptive capacity. How resilient is that system to those potential impacts? Can it cope with those impacts? And so factors that may increase adaptive capacity include high dispersal ability, so species that can disperse far distances, but beyond that, also species that don't have dispersal barriers. So an intact forest is going to be more likely to be adapted than a forest that is, kind of in a fragmented landscape. Tolerance to a wide variety of disturbances can help with adaptive capacity. And so together, these really help determine what is the vulnerability that our forests are experiencing. Most importantly, vulnerability, again, is not going to be uniform across the landscape. It's really dependent upon these site-specific characteristics. So things like forest conditions, forest health, your species assemblage, site characteristics, the soil of the site, the amount of deadwood on the ground that can help with water infiltration, disturbances, All of these things come into play when it comes to forest vulnerability. But beyond forest, climate change is leading to increased vulnerability of our forest operations. And I hope you were all blown away by this animation. It took way too long.
Which college were you in when you won in India?
So really, how is this showing up in the timing of our harvest? We're experiencing less snow, and so we're kind of having to shift how we're harvesting. The equipment used is also going to be impacted by less snow. You might not be able to use the same heavy equipment during different years. Logistics, how are you going to plan for future harvest? If you're doing a shelter wood, is reentry going to be feasible? These are all things that are starting to be affected by climate change. And again, when we're thinking about these impacts, it's really important to consider that spatial variability because it's not consistent across the landscape. So we're seeing greater variability in precipitation, and as many of you are aware, it's not the most important thing with precipitation isn't the total yearly amounts, which have increased by 7 inches since 1895, but it's really in the timing, intensity, and frequency of that precipitation.
Where's that red in Vermont?
This one?
Yeah, where's that?
Yeah. And this is just for May this year, so this was just showing kind of what conditions were like for this one. But so really when we're talking about precipitation, people typically think of flooding. And although lowland forests are susceptible to flooding, the greatest risk that forests have is soil erosion. And so this is all influenced by the upslope watershed, how steep the slope is, the soil type that you are on, as well as the amount of dead wood, which again can help with that water infiltration. So these are all really important characteristics that will help kind of temper that variability in precipitation. And these are all things that forest managers and management can have an influence on. Current predictions for the season are shaping up to have, once again, above average conditions for precipitation. So hopefully it won't be the same as last year, but we are expecting to see an increase. We're also seeing an increase in frequency of drought and severity of drought. So again, vulnerability to drought is really dependent on those site characteristics and species traits. So in terms of site characteristics, southern facing sites are more vulnerable. Drought intolerant species like Baltic fir and red spruce are likely to be more impacted again than oak forest or hickory forest. And seedlings are also really vulnerable. So seedling germination is extremely vulnerable to precipitation trends, but it's also largely influenced by seedbed type. So considering things like soil scarification can really help temper some of those precipitation issues when we're thinking of seedling survival. And I can get into more detail about that. There's a really great study done at UVM. But for time's sake, I'll just kind of leave it at that soil type as well as precipitation are really important for seedling survival, which is going to have those huge consequences in terms of the forest regeneration in the future. We're also experiencing increases in temperature with 2-degree warming in the summer and an average of 4-degree warming in winter. And for, again, predictions for this summer, we are expected to have hotter temperatures. It seems like every year, each year is record-breaking, and so we may experience that again this year. This warming is also translating to warmer winters. February is one of the warmest on records, and this has huge implications not only on forest health, but also on forest operations, as well as pest populations. So warmer winters can benefit species like hemlock willow adelgid because that cold default temperature is really important for their survival into the next season. So if we can see here, I know this is kind of tiny, but the last 5 years, we've had kind of a decline in those cold default temperatures. So more hemlock willow adelgid is surviving. So that allows for them to not only expand in their area, but with warmer temperatures, they can start to expand their range more northward. Additionally, this means less snow. So when we have less snow, we're going to have more freeze-thaw cycles, which allows for deeper freezing, which can be really important for roots because snow is really insulating. And so if you don't have that layer of that insulation, that freeze can get deeper and deeper and impact the future growth of your trees. So at Hubbard Brook Experimental Forest, they actually cleared out the snow for a winter season. And they found that the following growing season had reduced amount of growth for species that were in the areas that didn't have snowpack. So again, these have huge implications not only on the roots, but also in the future growth the following year. And so again, this can have those cascading effects that can be perpetuated into the following years. Climate change can also exponentially increase the impacts of these pests and pathogens. So we can see expanding ranges. We're also seeing greater invasions from invasive species. And so climate change accelerates those life cycles and can decrease the probability of those cold lethal temperatures. And so lastly, species traits or silvics also have a really large influence on vulnerability and adaptability. So if we look at silvics traits such as shade tolerance, germination, a species' ability to disperse, these can really change how species respond to disturbance. So for example, oaks are able to maintain photosynthesis during periods of intense drought, whereas other species might close their stomata and reduce their ability to photosynthesize. So this can translate to reduced growth impacts. Species like bitternut hickory can resprout, so that can be really advantageous in terms of responding to disturbance. Conifers have reduced damage during ice events, so all of these characteristics can kind of help either increase adaptability or increase their vulnerability. And so we've touched on these climate change issues we're experiencing, but now we're going to talk about some of the strategies that can help increase resilience or the recovery of the forest to things like climate change. So really we're talking about adaptation. And adaptation is the adjustment of systems in preparation or in response to climate change. And so how do we set up these ecosystems to those adjustments? Well, it's by developing actions that are robust across a range of potential changes. And so the overall goal of climate adaptation is really to improve forest complexity. And so these are fingers. I know it's a kind of funny looking image. I've taken this from Audubon because I really love how simple it is. This is a great way to walk into the woods. I know a lot of you are aware of how to look at a forest, but this can be a great way to communicate with landowners that you may be working with. And so on this hand lens, we're looking at complexity in the overstory, so the canopy. Do we see large, big trees? We see diversity of trees. The mid-story, is there something in the mid-story that's eventually, if we have a wind blow down, is there something that's going to occupy that space? What's the understory look like? Do we have adequate regeneration? And then on the other hand, we look at snags and cavities. Do we have great, good standing dead wood for wildlife? Is there dead wood on the ground to help with nutrients cycling and future nurse logs for species like yellow birch? Are there invasives? What's the leaf litter look like? Leaf litter can have huge implications on what can grow on that forest floor. If it's all, a thick layer of beech, you're likely going to have to change your strategies to figure out how you can get regeneration in that leaf litter. And so this is just kind of a rough assessment of how to add complexity to the forest and kind of have this critical lens when you're walking in the woods. So just to hammer this home, complexity is key. It's achieved through, again, that species diversity, age diversity. We also want a diversity of spatial arrangements, so having different aggregations of trees. This can be achieved through different forest management techniques. We want more deadwood on the ground as well as snags. But in addition to complexity, we want redundancy. And what I mean by redundancy is that in a vulnerable landscape, it's really important to have multiple species with similar characteristics so that if one is lost on the landscape, there's another species that can kind of fill that role. And so a good example of this is with beech bark disease, beech leaf disease. We are seeing a decline in our beech species. And as you all know, beech nuts are a really important resource for wildlife. And so by having other masting species that can help fill that niche, it's really important to have kind of that adaptive landscape. And so being forward thinking and what are we going to lose on the landscape and how can we kind of help assist with those changes. And so with the importance of complexity and redundancy in mind, here's a figure that represents the importance of these characteristics. So the dot kind of represents climate change or a pest or pathogen. And so we have a simple forest and a complex forest. And so the arrows are showing the change from the longer the arrow, the greater the change from the original forest. The thicker the arrow, the more likely it is to choose this recovery pathway. So if you have a stressor, a simple forest has less options in terms of recovery, whereas a more complex forest has greater recovery options in response to that change. And so this is just to kind of visually represent the importance of having that complexity on the landscape. And so how we can tangibly think about climate adaptation strategies is helpful to kind of organize them into 3 overarching concepts: resistance, resilience, and transition. This is part of a larger scale study called the Adaptive Silviculture for Climate Change, or the ASK project. Really great project if you want to do some light reading in the evening. And so really the goal of this project is to identify and implement actions that are robust across a range of potential changes or potential future conditions. So on one end of the spectrum, resistance is we're really trying to keep that system as it is. We're not really trying to add changes to that. Resilience is kind of somewhere in the middle. You're adding a little bit of change into that forest system, but you're ultimately trying to reflect what the historic condition is. And transition's a little bit different. It's where you're thinking more forward about how is the climate regime going to be in the future, and how can we help that forest reflect what it might look like in the future. And it's really important to note that this is not a discrete option. This is kind of a spectrum of options. And so in practice, this can kind of look like this. So resistance, this is from Jess Weichel. She's done some really great work on this project. So for the resistance treatment, this was done up in Second College Grant, northern New Hampshire. It's really just this matrix thinning to add pockets of new species. Resilience had a larger gap, 1/10 of an acre to 1/4 acre gaps were done here, as well as matrix thinning. And then in transition, you can see we have a much larger gap. So these are 1 acre gaps with some retention trees. And the goal within the resilience and transition treatment was really to increase shade intolerant species that are expected to fare better under climate change. In addition, there was some assisted migration plantings done in transition, but we won't go into that. This is really just to show that there's a broad range of options through forest management that can help forests be more resilient, and they're likely things you're already doing on the landscape. And so it's important to note, again, with our adaptation decisions, we want to avoid single objective mindsets. We don't want to treat these objectives as silos. So again, we'd rather optimize multiple goals because these goals often overlap. You know, if we're managing for carbon, you can also be managing for forest products. You can also be managing for biodiversity. It's really important with carbon not to just focus solely on carbon. You want to consider all of the other possible objectives. And although this is kind of cheesy, forests have the power of and. Shaylee Hoover from the Northern Research Station said this, and I really love it because it's so true. Forests can address so many objectives. They can address carbon storage and sequestration, as well as wood products to support the local economy and increase resilience and biodiversity. So it's just really important to remember that you can achieve a lot of different objectives through forest management. And all of this is well and good, but if we can't implement those practices through active management, because of climate change, you know, we're not going to be able to improve resilience and adaptation. And so, you know, with climate change, it's getting more difficult to actively harvest. And so I wanted to share a few resources that are available to support practitioners and landowners. And Catherine will get into a little bit more of this. But through FPR, we do have temporary bridge rentals. Dave Wilcox is your guy, so you can go to if you want to rent some bridges for some harvesting. And then I also recently attended this workshop, and I actually see a few familiar faces from it. It was through the, what is it called? The Trust to Conserve Northeast Forest Lands with New England Forestry Foundation. They just got this $15 million grant to help support loggers and landowners, as well as First Nations, to implement uneconomic silvicultural practices that increase carbon storage through the forest and in forest products. And so what's really great about this is they're piloting it this year, but they can help pay you to, thin a maturing forest that may not be economically feasible, but could be beneficial for that forest in the long run. So they can help pay for a practice that you wouldn't get money for, or things like cleaning your harvester to reduce invasives. So these are just a couple examples. Highly recommend going to their website. And I know I'm running out of time, but these are just a couple of resources if you're interested in learning a little bit more about climate adaptation. University Extension's great. NIAX is a really wonderful resource. Yeah.
Thanks, Al. Great job. Glad your pottery's mediocre because I need to have more time for this. So we're going to take a few minutes for burning, clarification, or just questions you want to get out of your head right away for Al. I'm watching the time. We have two more great presentations coming. We are kind of weaving a theme through these three. There is a logic to the order, but does anyone have any immediate questions they want to ask Al from what you just presented? Steve?
I saw the 10 acre plots in a 1 acre small group, what about 3?
Yeah.
15, 30.
That is a great question. So at that site, they did not do those larger cuts, but the Adaptive Silviculture for Climate Change is this broader network, but there are sister projects. And so at Groton State Forest, they've actually implemented some larger cuts. There's a 9 acre cut where they've done some plantings. And so, yes, those are great strategies. And especially at Groton, there's granitic soils, there's tons of beach. And so those larger cuts are part of those strategies.
So we did 300 walk.
Does that answer? I hope that answered your question to a degree.
Yeah,
But yes,
I think
larger cuts can absolutely be part of that
they work
strategy.
very well,
Yeah.
especially when you're doing restoration work.
Yes. Yeah, I was fortunate. I got to go on to the Bartlett Experimental Forest, and Mariko Yamasaki led the tour there. She's been there for 40 years, and they were showing, I think it was an 8 acre cut, and they were talking about, again, they have issues with beach and the soil type, but when they do those larger cuts, species like pin cherry show up, and then that enriches the soil for sugar maple to be able to regenerate, and they couldn't regenerate sugar maple any other way, and so those larger cuts can definitely have really great impacts.
I walked a 1,000 acre clear cut in the Green Mountain National Forest down near Bennington that was done 40 years ago. You ought to see the species diversity.
Yeah.
In that 1,000 acre.
I had one question. You said early on the intact forests are more likely to be adapted to climate change than a fragmented landscape, which makes perfect sense. Where is sort of the boundary when you're using patch cuts or even small clear cuts? Where's kind of that sweet spot of you want to use those tools to help the forest adapt and become more resilient, but you don't want the negative impacts of fragmentation?
Yeah, I would say, I wouldn't consider forest management practices necessarily as fragmentation. I would say that those larger cuts allow for species to be able to occupy that habitat, especially depending on the species you want to regenerate. So it's more about development happening in an area that's permanent land conversion. Yeah.
What's the pin cherry provide for the sugar maple essentially?
They were saying that it helped enrich the soil. It added to. Yeah, I'm not sure what the chemical makeup is, but they were finding that pin cherry leaves in the soil were helping kind of allow for that granitic soil to be a little bit better promoting for sugar maple.
Very cool.
Yeah.
I think on pin cherry it's a nitrogen fixer.
Yeah.
Like locust.
Yeah.
Definitely.
Awesome. Thanks. We'll come back to some of the themes she presented at the end when we have a more general discussion. So that kind of laid out some of the climate threats to our forest health, into silviculture, silvics in our forests, and some of the climate adaptation strategies that can be used. And at the end of this time, I'll talk a little bit about how the state and other partners are hoping to help defray some of the costs of implementing some of those sort of climate adapted silviculture practices. Next, we're fortunate to have Catherine Sorvillo presenting on the result of a survey that Steve Bick, who's not with us today, and Catherine worked on collaboratively on the supply chain impacts, on the climate change and supply chain impacts, how those two are intertwined. So this is some very recent research that they've done that Catherine will kind of share the specifics in the background. But Catherine is the Forest Economy Program Manager within the Vermont Department of Forest, Parks and Rec. She's been with the department since 2021, after previously working for the Natural Resources Board here in Vermont, and then the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources. So we're very lucky to have an economist, a statistician, and an Act 250 expert all rolled into one with Catherine. She holds a BS in Forestry from the University of Georgia, and she's a Vermont licensed forester and an SAF certified forester. She's done research on terrestrial salamanders and trophic interactions in southern Appalachian forest ecosystems. And in her current role, she works on maintaining Vermont's vibrant forest-based economy, reducing the dependency on fossil fuels, promoting active advanced wood heating, and also serving as a resource of the forest products industry on anything from data to market conditions, etc. In her free time, she enjoys sailing and fiber arts. So we're hoping this morning's presentation on wood fiber will help her expand her offerings in fiber arts. But so Catherine, over to you.
Thank you. Yeah, I do have several dresses and pencil. Thank you guys all for being here. It's great to see a nice crowded room for this topic. So like Oliver said, this is a project that FPR is collaboratively partnering with Northeast Forest. So Steve Bick on. So Steve is not here, he's out in Montana. And he graciously agreed to allow me to be the one to present this data. I will do my best to answer questions, but there may be some situations where Steve is better suited, and we'll just make sure to connect, that way we can get you the right answers. So just, I always like to do a little data acknowledgement. So this is a USDA Forest Service LSR project grant, which Allie also has been working with. So it's the climate adaptation for Vermont's forest and forest products supply chain. The part that Steve and I have been working on is really specific to that supply chain side. And then some other aspects of the themes that we're bringing in also include this cooperative agreement. So in this grant project on the supply chain climate adaptation, we're looking to do a needs assessment. We did do a needs assessment. So it's a 3-year project, and in this first year, it's the needs assessment to evaluate kind of the current impacts of climate change and the disruptions that it's having on current operations and what people are experiencing in the woods. We're asking about what adaptation strategies people are currently implementing, but also what they're looking potentially to be doing in the future. And finally, at the gaps in both resources and knowledge transfer, and how we can best support people working in the woods to adapt successfully to climate change. So how many of you saw one of these postcards come in the mail? Yeah, awesome. So Steve sent out these postcards. He used a couple of different mailing lists. I know I got one. And then he also had it promoted in a few different publications and on social media to get everybody out there to, give us some responses. And then in year 2, the plan is that based on those responses and what people are identifying as gaps and needs and desires, we'll then start creating and compiling those resources to support and fill those gaps. And then in year 3 is doing that knowledge transfer piece of actually getting this information and these tools out into the field, into practitioners, into service providers' hands, so that we can make sure that this is being shared back out. So the first part is on this impact to operations. So these questions, there's a number of questions that we had in this survey. It was all about what are you experiencing over the past 12 months in the woods. And just for transparency, we did this survey in early 2024, so that does include 2023 and the weather events that we experienced there. So, what seasons of the year challenge your ability to sell, harvest, or procure timber and forest products? We can see that spring is kind of the biggest challenger, but they're all not great, right? So that's always concerning. How confident are you in your ability to sell, harvest, or procure timber and wood products in each of these seasons? So the blue is not at all confident, no confidence in my ability to do this work. The dark green is high, pretty sure unless like really, really unusual events happen, I'm gonna be able to do this. And spring is that big outlier. We always know about spring mud season, but one thing that I saw when I was starting to put this together was also that fall. So it's clear that we're starting to see more and more. We've heard anecdotally the 2 mud seasons. It's starting to show up in the data more consistently.
Catherine, sorry if you said this. How many respondents roughly did you have to the survey you sent out?
Yeah, so I believe there was around just shy of 100 usable responses. So there was a couple partial completions. There were a couple there was some clear computer technology and like multiple submissions of the exact same thing. So just shy of 100 usable. I know it looks like there's data missing, but there's not. So rate the importance of these factors in your ability to sell, harvest, or procure timber and forest products. This is actually how this turned out. The first thing Oliver emailed me was, I think there might be data missing in this slide. And I had to say, no, actually, it's not. This is really the only response. These are the factors that people are reporting as being the biggest ones. And there is, as you look at it, some themes going on, right? Lack of freezing in traditional winter months, increased soil moisture, the prolonged non-productive periods. We use the non-productive periods as mud season. Public access and infrastructure reliability. These are all operations, climate change impacts affecting our forest operations. So now that we've covered kind of the I should also say these are still preliminary. We've completed the survey, but we're still working on some of the analysis. So these are preliminary. Those are some of the data results on impacts. Next, we asked a series of questions on what are you doing now to respond and to continue to operate. And I just pulled a few of the more common answers that we got. So longer duration timber harvesting contracts, 2 to 3 years may not be long enough anymore, especially if you're going to have winter that doesn't cooperate. You're not able to get it, so you might start seeing more extended contracts. Increased use of stone. There's actually a quote that we got from someone. One of the respondents, he said, I'd rather buy 10 loads of stone than be out of work for a week. So that's a big one. Weather conscious trucking decisions and scheduling, which Al hit on as one of the strategies for adaptation. Adaptive logging practices on the ground, building larger stockpiles during favorable conditions, and expanded procurement radius. Those last two, I think, are also really important. How many of you in the pandemic experienced a hard time maybe getting like toilet paper or paper towels at the store? Yeah. A lot of that was driven by just-in-time inventory procurement practices, and a lot of our forest product sector had also started to move to some extent to just-in-time. There was a lot of challenges with operating in that way, but as we see more and more weather and variability, it becomes really hard to have that type of a system. You just have no buffer whenever there's any sort of disruption. And so that building larger stockpiles allows you to continue to work when you can't get those logs out of the woods. So one thing that didn't show up was equipment changes. But so about 30% of the respondents said that they had changed their equipment or harvesting systems. But then I did a little bit more digging on that because I've heard a lot about people moving to cut to length and changing up their equipment. So the 2012 column there, that's from the Leon Benjamin paper. did a survey up in Maine that's specifically for the respondents from Vermont. So in 2012, 7% cut to length, 2024, 23%. So there is a significant change happening there, as well as the shifts in tree length and whole tree. The other includes hybrid combinations, so that's just a catch. The long term, so these are like the future, what are you doing, what are you thinking about doing, how are you going to maintain the long-term economic business sustainability of your work? These are in diversifying products, services offered, and revenue streams. That was the top one. Most people selected that, 45%. Just being nimble, being able to respond when you can go out and work, being able to go out and do that. Staying at the same level, but taking a different approach. I think that's where the typing responses help a lot, because that could mean a number of different things. But I think for the service providers and technical service providers as well, the 30% staying the course is really important for us all to know, because that may not always be feasible as we go through these changes. Just continuing to do exactly what we do as we've always done may not be the best course of action. And so we should all know that is a 30%, that's a good number of people who responded to that. So we just need to be aware of that. And then finally, the gaps. What do you need to be able to adapt, to be able to continue to do the important work that you do? And how can we support you in doing this? The number one request was grants for reusable and improvement structures. So Al highlighted one option, which is our temporary bridge program. We did also just have the Vermont legislature appropriate additional funding for us to be able to expand that water quality assistance program pilot. Dana's group did a great job in the legislature advocating for that. Next on the list for high priorities were cost share payments for climate adaptive timber harvesting and scheduling practices. FPR is currently going through the administrative process of finalizing a grant that we received that will do that, which is great. 38% greater availability of service providers who understand climate adaptive practices. That's what we're doing with this project right now. So I was happy to see that was one of the high choices. Low interest loans for equipment and improvements. There's a table over in the other building with Vermont Economic Development Association, VEDA. They have several $1 million specifically for that now, for forest products businesses, loggers. And then, although it's only 26%, this one's dear to my heart because this is what I'm doing right now, is the technical and business advice from people familiar with the forest products industry. And making sure that we're effectively doing that knowledge transfer and sharing and supporting the forest economy, which is so important to Vermont and to the region and our way of life, and making sure that we're able to adapt and be sustainable. That's the end of my section. Apologies if I went really fast. Yes, it's the hazard of spending a lot of time staring at these slides over time. Are there any questions? I'm happy to.
You've got two questions in the back. Thank you very much, Catherine. I found the tempo to be good. I did it was my second time seeing it, so I had that advantage. But let's see if we have clarification or follow-up questions for Catherine. I saw Steve and Dave. Dave, why don't you go first?
I was just going to ask, you showed a slide that didn't have anything and then it had a bunch.
Oh yeah. Let me.
Can you read down some of the things that they didn't choose?
Yep.
I'm just curious what those sorts of things were.
One of them was deep snow, which we haven't seen a lot of. So that was not apparently a source of a barrier to getting work done.
That's out in Brandon, Wisconsin. This one. All right, so from top down towards the bottom, it's deep snow, strong markets for wood products, low-grade market, lack of labor, fluctuating markets and mill consolidation, views on timber harvesting, mill demand, loss of contractors, lack of market/mills, early road postings, contractor availability, constant weather events, and ability to retain employees.
None of those.
They didn't pick those as
There was one response for each of those.
Was there any limit to the number respondents could take?
No.
Yeah.
I agree with all of it. That's native. Yeah. You guys had a question?
Aren't they saying that that's critical to their operation?
Yes, the person who selected it said
It
it was
does make
critical. It
sense.
isn't, yep.
It's saying it's the most important factor, those are the most important factors, so that's why you're not seeing a variation, they're all saying this is critical, right?
Well, no, so these are based on the proportion of responses, the number of people who checked that
Yep.
as being critical, not important, all of that. So here, more than 50% said this was critical. But up here, it was one person.
Wouldn't it rank as not important if they
Yeah.
didn't select that?
Because they could have selected multiple things. They said it was critical to them. There just wasn't more people who also said it was critical.
Or not critical, right?
There was, I think there was 5 selections in that.
Yeah, you could, it was a check
So
or
there, it's
apply,
just
right?
based on what
So
that
check the
actual
ones-
person selected.
Yeah.
So you can only choose one.
Yes.
Yeah, so it's curious. We've spent a lot of time, so at least on public lands, dealing with the perception issue. We've heard a lot about lack of markets, mills, closures, the labor issue.
Low grade.
Exactly, and inadequate access to the low grade. So it's curious that none of those were selected. It's something we can.
They were I want to be clear, it's just that more responses selected these ones at the bottom.
Okay.
And this survey went out, in the spring, late winter?
Late winter, early spring.
Well, the thing is we were coming off in the logging field just because of the poor weather conditions. The markets were unbelievable. You could sell anything to anybody, even Eskimos. So, everybody's kind of thinking at the time, things are good on that end.
If you could just get out.
Others, yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and I also want to say, we did not ask about this question over time. It was just a snapshot in time. And again, preliminary, we haven't done the sensitivity for the time of year, the different conditions that existed. I'm just telling you what we got.
Yeah, was this sent out winter of '24 or winter of '23?
24, several months ago.
'24, so the market's obviously much different than they were a year ago.
Correct.
Clearly. So you can.
Yeah, this will be fascinating to track over time.
This winter, the markets were still strong and everything, it's only until this spring it's went to shit. Pretty frankly is what it is. Pine and things like that, the market's been very strong all through this winter, it's only right now that people it's really starting to hit.
It'd be interesting if you broke that question down into, split sell, harvest, and procure timber into 3 different questions. See how they answered it.
Yeah, and we can do that. Again, preliminary, still working on some of that.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Absolutely.
Can you go to the next slide, just to refresh our memory on which ones were chosen?
And this, again, just the proportion of selections.
So we don't know how many people responded. We just know of the respondents, those were the proportions of people that chose those.
Yeah, so of the people who selected public road access as being important, 29% said it was critical, 30% said very important, 20%, that's how it ranked down.
Could they, sorry, I know we're focusing on it so much, could they only choose 5, one thing as critical, or could they choose multiple things as critical?
That's why I brought,
We're supposed to choose one.
I don't recall if we limited.
I'm guessing given the one response for all the others, it was probably you could only choose one. maybe. I don't know.
No, you could definitely choose more than one.
That's critical. Okay, let's see.
Just looking at the number of checks and the number of responses.
Okay.
It would not add up.
So it's, you know, it's interesting. I think the interest in this shows gives you and Steve an opportunity as you completely review the data and get into analysis.
There will be more discussion.
Yeah, exactly. Dan,
Catherine, who was this, so you got 100 responses. So who was the survey sent to, and then do you know who responded in terms of
Yep, we do.
that?
So, and this one was a check-all that applied, recognizing that you can be a forester and a landowner,
Okay.
right? So we didn't say you have to choose one or the other, it was a check-all that applied to you. So about 55%. 56% forest landowners, 32% loggers, 32% consulting foresters, 7% procurement foresters, 5% public agency foresters, 6% forest products truckers, and then about 20% around there, mill owner and operators, wood using mill owner.
Steve, do you want?
Yeah, so my point, I wanted to talk about, you know, the stone on the landings increase. The size of the trucks have changed tremendously. You know, because, you know, compared to, let's say, 10 years ago, there were many mills that you could take the whole product to that mill. Nowadays, margins are diversified. I'm a consulting forester and I run around 20 timber sales a year. And we put a lot of stone down on our landings just because, one, the trucks are way more expensive. They don't want to go in there and get trashed. You get pulled in, pulled out, that ties up a skidder where it should be pulling wood, not trucks. The other thing is too, is that, again, we make it, you know, for tractor trailer accessibility or at least trucking pumps. And, you know, so that isn't, we've been doing that now for the past 10 years, 15 years, about really putting down, you know, sound landings, skid or landing pads and stuff. And things are changing, especially too, is that, you know, going onto the town roads, you can't be leaving crap all over the place. You can't be undermining the road and things like that. It just, it works. And as I explained to landowners, we can get a small little log truck in there and we can go this far. We can go 30 miles. If we make that landing suitable for a trucking pump that gets in and out unassisted, we can truck 80 miles or we can more. But if you make it tractor trailer accessible, your markets are the world.
So a landowner is
Oh, they
accepting that extra
Yes,
cost.
because the thing is, the loggers aren't paying that cost. These landowners understand that that's infrastructure, and they get it. You know, and so and that's one thing that, you know, let's not make it a landing that's the cheapest that we can do. Let's make it functional.
You know what happens at closeout? Does the gravel stay?
It's pretty expensive to get it there. We leave it there.
Does the extra access to the world pay for the gravel?
Yeah, you take a load of veneer out of there, or you go, you know, with high-end log systems in Quebec. Yeah, that people see it, especially. I don't know. I can get $90 an hour for like instead of 30. People like that.
You're seeing some of that too in our area, because there is these mats. It's not an outage, so to speak, it's a reusable expense. So I think that's something to look at for funding wise.
Yeah, and it's also,
Have those available.
it's a conversation, like you said, Steve, to have with landowners too, because it may cost you a little bit more that first year, but over time.
Oh, but you get that money back on the job, on that, you know, just increased marketing opportunities.
Yeah, on the maps, again, we're fortunate to have Dana here. He identified a U.S. Forest Service temporary bridge and mats program where there's grant money from the Inflation Reduction Act available to states and to partners to make temporary crane mats available on a rent or rent-to-own basis to logging contractors. And so we're pursuing that. It'll likely be professional line contractors in the Northeast and or FPR, getting funding from those for the Forest Service and making them available to loggers on a rental or rent-to-own basis. Sir?
I think that those are appropriate measures for like big
Yeah.
tracts of land, but we're talking about like defragmentation, landowners
No,
help.
I'm talking about
I know.
20-acre timber sales, 50 acres.
What are you seeing?
Well, I'm an operator, small, and I could never afford to put 10 loads of stone on a 20
You don't
acre
necessarily,
parcel.
you don't
I'm going
necessarily.
for red spruce or something. I mean, you know, there's just not always enough money in the stand to offset that. So, you know, as landowners and tracts are getting smaller, mechanized guys don't even want to move in unless it's absolutely primo. But most of those people that are owning, you know, 30, 40 acres, many of them that, you know, come to me don't want a mechanized outfit. So sometimes there's not a one-size-fits-all solution.
So when Catherine talks about adaptive logging practices on the ground, what does that mean? Anything to you? Does that resonate with you? Like, oh yeah, I did this on a job last year.
I'm an adaptive farmer.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, you do have to remain flexible and, you know, whether you're putting bridges in or doing different things, I think they're all good. One thing I don't see is like, you know, you get to who like has changed like, you know, the conveyance methods, whether they're, you know, not doing upholstery anymore. The cost of just changing your equipment is exponential, and that's why you have 30% saying doing business as usual. And just people just can't afford to change out their equipment. It's actually an interesting thing, you know, like we never look at equipment. No one here designs equipment. Equipment historically is designed for one objective: effective, fast harvesting, and then it has to pay for itself. You know, in Scandinavia and Europe, you know, they're kind of looking at different types of scales and things, but it'd be interesting to see like funding towards different types of conveyance methods.
Yeah. Yes, Catherine, Dave, go ahead, Dave.
No, I just wanted to, this slide, the terminology is interesting here, just so folks know. Tree length is traditional hand felling, limbing the tree at the site, cutting off the top. Whole tree is a fell or buncher in the ground. So that's a lot of people will see tree length and think that that's fell or buncher in the ground, but it's not.
Yeah, tree length is your limbing in.
So just a point of
And
clarification.
so you see that increase in whole tree, which you just described, and then also the increase in cut to length.
Yeah.
At the expense of tree length.
Hand felling.
Right.
What is other?
Other is, most of those were like hybrid combination. So they did some level of those at multiple levels.
Yeah, as Catherine said, so Vermont Economic Development Authority has worked largely with the ag sector over the years, but thanks to the roadmap, which we'll talk about in a minute, and some efforts by our commissioner, they're making $3 million available with low interest financing for loans for logging equipment. And so that would probably buy down 2 or 3 percentage points from prime. So it's not,
It's actually up with VAC, so right now it's between 6 and 7% is what you'd be looking at.
thanks. So it's not certainly free money, but I think it's slightly better than what's out there. So I'm really curious to see how much interest there is in that, and how quickly they'll get applications for up to $3 million for that low interest financing. I know they already have one application in, and it was only announced a couple of days ago, so that's a good sign. But our Commissioner Danny will talk about that in the closing session a bit more this afternoon.
And I just want to respond to one thing that you said, with the staying the course and how there's, you know, financial and like structural barriers to people, you know, not saying that. Absolutely agree. That's why I tried to couch it as like service providers and technical assistance providers. This is really important for us to know. It's not that this is a bad response. It's just that we have work to do, right? Like we need this to support. How do we make this as accessible as these other options? Just wanted to clarify.
I'm going to unplug. Any last questions for Catherine? I'm going to unplug her.
And I'll be around for the end of the discussion too.
I think it's coming, but in case it doesn't. Great. So thanks. So we sort of had the climate background information. We had sort of the results from 100 different logging businesses, forest economy business that were surveyed, and then we kind of wanted to hear, what one large operator was seeing. So we have Chris, who's the public affairs manager, Chris Fife, public affairs manager for Weyerhaeuser, to come in and talk about what they're seeing on their properties that they manage in Vermont region, and also how they're using one adaptation strategy and the role of third-party certification to maintain their operations. So Chris came all the way over from Maine, is that correct? Maine to join us, so thanks for making the trip. Chris is the public affairs manager for Weyerhaeuser, responsible for government affairs and community relations for Weyerhaeuser's businesses in New England, West Virginia, and Michigan. These include mills, an engineered lumber mill, timberlands, and natural climate solutions business. Chris spent 10 years as a timberland supervisor managing Plum Creek, and then Weyerhaeuser's holdings in the Northeast Kingdom, Vermont, and next door New Hampshire. And he maintains many strong connections to the land and people there. He's a graduate of the University of Maine, a licensed forester in Vermont and Maine. He lives in central Maine where he manages a 3-acre woodlot with his wife, cutting firewood, foraging, and sugaring. I look forward eventually to doing some skiing with Chris. I hear he's a great backcountry skier. And when he comes to Vermont, he sleeps... Aspiring. When he comes to Vermont, he finds a flat place to pull over, sleeps in his truck, and is close to the forest. And so for a guy who slept in his truck last night, he looks great. So, Chris, over to you.
I can't tell you anything. You can give all my secrets. Hopefully I smell it. Well, this has been a great session already. I could probably just say nothing, sit back down and maintain the trends, but excellent questions, great discussion. Really appreciate both Al and Catherine's presentations and how we can kind of see the thread of how these thoughts, how we're all thinking about climate adaptation. And as we were talking about this, I was thinking, one of the things with climate that makes it difficult, I think, from a practitioner point of view, is it's easy, even though we're hearing it and hearing it and hearing it. We're so used to living in New England, hearing the phrase if you don't like the weather, just wait a minute. As we walked back to get lunch, it was spitting rain on me. It's been 90 degrees yesterday, and who knows? It feels like it's cooling off. Maybe there'll be snow this afternoon. So we're kind of used to that, and I think even though from a scientific point of view and from even what we're observing personally, we see the changes. It's sometimes hard to say, I'm going to develop a strategy. I'm going to go ahead and start to put some thought into what I'm going to do so this doesn't have a negative effect down the road, versus just kind of, well, I'll deal with it this year. I'll deal with it this season. Hopefully it gets better. So this conversation has been really good, I think, from that point. I really look at this through two lenses, particularly in developing this short presentation. One is obviously as forester working for a large landowner, Weyerhaeuser. We have 86,000 acres in Vermont, 23,000 in New Hampshire, and 870,000 around that in Maine. So a little over 1 million acres in New England. Very different scale, I realize, right? When we're talking about the fingers to look at the stand, I'm thinking, you better back those fingers up a bit. We need to see the landscape here. And some of these, I appreciate the question about opening sizes and things. The other lens that I look at this through is the recent participation in the Forest Futures roadmap process. I was on the advisory panel with some of you, and that process really tried to look holistically at our industry in Vermont, so and the wider forest economy in Vermont too. So the things that are kind of bolted onto that, and we talked about it, and it came up through that adaptation, climate change. It's right in some of the pillars specifically called out, and I would say probably in all of the pillars as an item that you can find that thread through the report. So if you haven't had a chance to, you'll see this later as the end of the day here, and I think Danny will have some really good things to say about that. The other kind of two pieces here is I'm thinking about adaptation as both biological, but also operational. And I think we've seen that theme already. So probably just see a bit of a continuation of that here with my presentation. So, when I think about climate change and forests, there's a few quotes that I really like. One is this one from the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. In the long term, a sustainable forest management strategy aimed at maintaining or increasing forest carbon stocks while producing an annual sustained yield of timber, fiber, or energy from the forest will generate the largest sustained mitigation benefit. Then from, actually it's in the roadmap report, but this is a study that was done just looking at the economic input from our industry in Vermont. In 2020, $2.1 billion, $770.8 million in value add from our industry. And then finally, also from the roadmap, looking at the goals under that first pillar, there's widespread agreement that the overarching approach to forest management should focus on maintaining healthy forests that are resilient to climate change and capable of supporting a viable and diverse forest economy. So why is this important? I think those all really point to why it's important for us to think about this as more than just we're having a rainy summer or we get late snowstorms in the spring. So there's so much I could talk about here, and I said I want to just try to focus on one thing. And one thing that I'm familiar with is the Sustainable Forestry Initiative. Weyerhaeuser, as many large companies are, it's third-party certified, and we're certified under the Sustainable Forestry Initiative. So I thought I would use that as a way to speak about this adaptation and how we're thinking about it. So the Sustainable Forestry Initiative and their latest standard, the Forest Management Standard, has now an objective on climate smart forestry. And I know some of you probably, that's a maddening term. I know for me, people think it means different things to different people, but I'm just speaking of it as a title to this objective. They're calling it climate smart forestry. And what it requires under this objective 9 now in the standard is that we identify and address climate change risks to forest and forest operations, and we develop adaptation strategies so that when we're audited, part of what we're audited on is, what are you doing to address climate change? So of course, the first thing we need to think about is what are the risks? And you're going to say, I think Al already covered this really, but as we think about our operations, particularly across New England, we think about the risks, we recognize some of those same things. So the key risks that we really, some of the ones we've identified are decreased forest health and productivity. We've talked about that, some of the disease we're seeing, some of the insects, and that's sometimes weather driven, sometimes just the patterns of weather. There's various factors there, but more stressors. Damage to road, stream crossings in particular. I don't need to tell this room about that. I mean, if you haven't seen it on your own property, you've seen it on the news. I mean, we've had towns and cities underwater. We've had roads completely wash away, and it's been no different in the woods. So on our ownership, the 2 late big storms this year created just an enormous amount of damage. And as the snow finally went, and as we've been able to get back in on roads as spring has turned to summer, we're just finding more and more damage across all of our infrastructure, and we're just one of many. And this is with attention that's been paid over time to trying to upgrade crossing, do things to kind of harden the infrastructure. So we're definitely seeing an impact from these events. This next one, increased concern / regulation of water resource and wildlife species. And to me, that's really public focus. So this is kind of about our reputation as an industry. This is the public seeing the pictures of the washed out forest road and saying, oh, look how terrible that is. That must have been because of a clear cut. And there's no one there filling that void. I'm sorry. And then finally, two things: increased wildfire risk. We don't talk a lot about that, but we actually are seeing, particularly in certain seasons, where we're having these almost like micro drought conditions, where we have real risk of fire, and it's different than what we've seen in the past. And then finally, interruptions of normal work conditions. We just spent a lot of time talking about that. So once we identify those risks, now we need to think about our adaptations to those risks. So for the decreased forest health and productivity, there's a few things that we're trying to do. Obviously one is maintain a diverse and healthy forest and our soils. You'll see there's interrelation of a lot of these. So by implementing VMPs, you can obviously protect your soils. Maintaining a diverse and healthy forest, part of that is in recognition. So staff awareness and training on pests, diseases. I find that from each of the states we operate in, the pest reports that come out and the updates, sometimes they're monthly, sometimes they're quarterly, but they kind of they tell you what's going on, what is the state observing, across a wide area. And those are really helpful to recognize things like we've heard about beech leaf disease today. That's something that over just the last couple of years is, it's gone from just coming on the radar to kind of exploding across the region. So watching things like that and thinking about the impact and recognizing when they're out there so you can respond. And then collaboration with partners on science, monitoring, et cetera. We do a lot with the university, with other partners to try to make sure that we're not only aware of what's out there, but that we're collaborating on, why and how can we move forward. We've done work in the Appalachian area down in West Virginia on the cherry dieback, which is something that's been going on now for probably a decade. And then at the end of the day, the researchers are kind of scratching their head, and it really seems to be climate related, but probably multi-factor. So I think we're going to see more and more of those type of things, but working collaboratively helps us to know what we're dealing with and develop better approaches to dealing with it. On damage to road and stream crossings, again, it comes down to planning and design of our roads, our upgrades, our crossings. We do a lot of training with our staff on new techniques, on thinking about how we can implement different types of crossings. And some of that innovation, comes from all aspects that I like to share. When I was working in the woods here in Vermont, we were using skidder mats, but we were using them on our bigger crossings. And one of our logging contractors said, well, why don't you just turn that sideways and put two more pieces of, two more 8x8s on that, and you can have almost like a mini box culvert. I said, yeah, why don't we do that? Go ahead. He built a couple of them. We tried them, and then we were able to use something that gave us a little bit bottom and less impact on just small, ephemeral to, minor intermittent type streams. So again, I think there's really room for this, for us as a group to really develop these strategies. Sometimes they're as kind of simple as that. They can come from anywhere. So we're not really saying we've got the answers. We're saying we need to figure this out. We've worked with Trout Unlimited on doing a lot of crossing replacement at land in Vermont, and with the Fish and Wildlife Department, we've done some in-stream restoration work, and along with that, so those two kind of go hand in hand. And we want to work on the fisheries side of it and the in-stream restoration for fish, but also thinking about the impact that those culverts have as barriers has really dovetailed with. Most of them are undersized, aren't good crossings, and are great candidates for replacing from a fisheries and just infrastructure point of view. And so we've done a fair amount of cooperative crossing structure replacement. On the concern over regulation, I think the key here is AMPs, VMPs for us on the operational side, really focusing on making sure we're doing things right in the woods, making sure that we're keeping up to date on how to implement You know, the state and Dave, I credit him with having helped develop an app that loggers, foresters can now have on their phone, landowners, anybody, that has the whole AMP manual right on the phone and has some other tools that really help to be effective at implementing these. You know, if we do that well, we can help to avoid that extra level of scrutiny that then potentially turns into an extra level of regulation. Again, staying current on science, being proactive, collaborating, I think that's kind of what this is all about. Increased risk of wildfire, for us, we're increasing our coordination with agencies so that we, you know, it feels like when I got into forestry 3 decades ago, we had a really close relationship with the forest rangers and the firefighting side of it. And that was a piece of what we did. Over time, I think as land ownership changed, and you know, for small landowners that maybe was never quite the same. And I think making sure that we're including that, you know, the first responders, the fire departments, and then the Forest Service, forest rangers, depending on what state you're working in. And then also, you know, for us, increasing our staff preparedness. A lot of times we're the resource, so, you know, if we have a fire near a logging job, the contractor might call and say, we've got a fire, you know, we need to get that word to the Forest Service. They need to get out there, but we also have to help provide the resources, maps, and whatever else to get them to the right place and to help with accessibility. So these are things that, you know, maybe just make common sense, but if you don't have them in a plan and you haven't trained and thought about them, people don't always react well when the situation presents itself. And then interruptions to normal work conditions. Again, we've talked a lot about this. I don't think I need to belabor it, but some of the things that, you know, for us as a landowner, using trained contractors that understand our policies around self-shutdown. So when it's too wet, non-operating, using forester monitoring of operations. You know, we, being a large landowner, we have our own foresters and they're spread across the region. They have responsibility for the different harvest operations that are going on, just like a consulting forester might on a private job. And so making sure that there's regular check-ins and documentation of what's going on the jobs, and then proactive planning. I was in a session this morning that talked about LiDAR and some of the new tools for planning. Those tools have been really important to us as a company in developing plans that have enough flexibility to say, wow, it's too wet. We know this is a drier area. So using LiDAR for things like wet area mapping, just the ability to lay out skid trails in the right place. It's that bank of knowledge that the forester can then draw from, which is now, you know, one, so much larger than it ever was, but also so much more portable. I guess I would say all the foresters are carrying tablets, and the tablets have all of that information, and they can swap between what they're looking at on the fly in the field. So that's really helpful in the planning piece. And that's a picture of some of that mapping right there. So, you know, that's really what I had. I think, you know, I just had this quote off of from Weyerhaeuser. Potential impacts of climate change on forest health and productivity are constantly evolving. And understanding and incorporating climate-related risks and opportunities into our business decisions will be vital to ensuring our working forests remain the climate solution and a model of success for generations to come. That first piece about constantly evolving, I think, is so important to this discussion, because what we're seeing as climate threats, those are changing. And so we can't think we've developed a plan, now we're good. I think it's going to require constant review. You know, those risks may change, and we may have to say, what are the new risks, and then look at new adaptation. But for us, you know, this climate smart forestry objective in our sustainability SFI program is helpful in, you know, in our thinking through that. So that's what I have.
Thanks, Chris. Yeah, it's great to hear from that larger landowner perspective. You know, and one thing that struck me is this, Al sort of used the term recovery pathways and sort of thinking about how active forest management using what you guys call, I think, or the name that you talked about, climate smart forestry, what I've heard Al's advisor, Tony D'Amato, talking about is climate adapted silviculture. The FBR has been using the term ecological forestry, but how all those, whatever term you want to use it, how those can help support more recovery pathways and help forests become more resilient to climate change. And then how do we communicate that to the public, that going in and actively managing these forests will make them more resilient than just leaving them alone. It's sort of a counter narrative to what we're hearing from proponents of reforestation, which based on some of the comments we've been receiving about our work on public land seems to be a large percentage of Vermont's population these days. Let me open it up. We have about 10-15 minutes left. Does anybody have any questions, follow-up questions for Chris and the work that Weyerhaeuser is doing?
Always good for a question. You mentioned that Weyerhaeuser values your third-party certification through SFI. One thing that I've heard from a lot of landowners or other businesses that own timberland is that third-party certification can be administratively costly and a barrier to them. How has Weyerhaeuser experienced this? Is it a challenge?
So I think again, it's scale. That's definitely. I can understand why people would say that. There's certainly cost. It is costly, but the cost of not being third-party certified for a company the size of Weyerhaeuser, with both manufacturing and forest, timberlands over around 11 million acres across the country. There's an expectation that the public has, and it's one way to demonstrate that you're committed to sustainability and to practices that are addressing things like climate, among other things. So I think for a company the size of Weyerhaeuser, it's important. As you get smaller in size, when you look at the lens of like a small landowner, it's been really tough. There have been attempts at looking at ways to maybe do certification, a group certification for landowners, or certify other parts of the process, and those have had mixed levels of success, I guess I would say. But I will say Tree Farm is a certification process, and they have been around for, I say that because of the history with SFI, right? But Tree Farm, is a way for landowners to demonstrate they're committed to some of those very same things, and so I think there's other programs that are really effective for small landowners, and there probably will be more as well as things go forward. Thank you.
Just to follow up, so Weyerhaeuser does feel that having that third-party certification adds to their credibility.
And frankly, being third-party certified, many of the mills that we sell to require, and I think you heard that this morning with Tanbark, but their customers are requiring that they're purchasing sustainably sourced fiber. So if we didn't have third-party certification, we could limit ourselves on who our customers would be as well.
Dave and then Al.
Chris, I'm just curious what you're seeing with the recent, poor weather conditions, how the contractors are doing in the Northeast Kingdom. Do you have enough contractors? How are they adapting based on maybe some of the slides that we just saw in the last presentation?
So, I have to say, I may not be the best one to answer that question. I think our probably our timberlands manager out of Lancaster could give a better analysis of that at this point, but we have been able to harvest the wood that we have planned to harvest. We're really concerned about the demographics across New England of the logging force, the workforce. We, like so many, and Dana can echo this, he's done a huge amount of work to try to find ways to bring people into the industry, because we recognize we have the ability to grow. I mean, part of the Forest Futures Roadmap is not just how do we maintain what we have, but how can we really build on what we have. And I think that was the point of starting off with Tanbark today. And if we're going to build, we need more capacity. And right now, we don't necessarily see the more capacity there. And we've heard about some of the barriers. One of the huge ones is, the cost of equipment. We have aging equipment that, maybe was handed down through a family type operation, and now it's just not adequate for the conditions that people are facing. I think in the Northeast Kingdom, there's a culture still of people who work in the woods. So we have students who, and Chris was here, he had to leave, but anyway, we have students, programs that are training students, and there's an interest in getting into that. So that's really positive. I know younger people who are loggers that are in the business, and that's encouraging to me. But I think these challenges are real and affecting loggers. And when one of the pieces on this question said prolonged shutdown, and I know you can interpret that as spring being longer, but in my mind, I also interpret that as, right or wrong, we're seeing shutdowns the last 2 or 3 days. And a 2 or 3 day shutdown can actually be more impactful to the business than, say it used to be, maybe I have to go home for the afternoon. Now I can't work for 2 or 3 days. And then I try to work for 2 days, and then I shut down again because it rained again. I mean, that actually is almost harder, I think, than knowing it's coming in the spring, plan to do our maintenance, we shut down and we get back to work. Not minimizing the fact of a longer mud season being impactful, but there's things like that anyway that I think are having an impact. And frankly, it's talked about AMPs, but if you have to shut down, if you know a big storm's coming, and we're asking you as a landowner, when we think there's a big weather event coming, to make sure that things are kind of buttoned up and more stable, and you're having to spend time every 2 or 3 days in the summer buttoning up something that then you're going to go back over to try to access more wood. I mean, it's just a lot of cost and effort and a lot of lost productivity. So those things are hard to measure, but they're challenges for sure. Not to paint a bleak picture. I try to be an optimist, but realistically, there's pretty big challenges there.
Yeah, I think the workforce is a huge part of, how we move forward. And, we're trying to be optimistic, and I think that's one of the things we have to do. Because I see it, a lot fewer and fewer contractors, and contractors that are kind of on the edge.
And there's the recognition from the logging contractors that coming out of the July 10th floods and other weather events, there was no support to the logging sector in the same way there was the business owners in the ag sector for all those business interruptions. And so that's partially why the legislature added $1 million to the budget this year to help logging contractors in Vermont apply with AMPs and implement climate adaptation practices, recognizing that they may have been left out previously. So help going forward, let's do a pilot program. So Catherine mentioned expansion of the water quality systems program, and we'll try to get that going as soon as possible after July 1, with the goal of it really being a pilot. If we can do some successful work, go back to the legislature and say, yeah, this worked. We help loggers in XYZ ways, and that's reduce some of their costs, and they're still getting into the woods a bit more, but we need to expand it. So that's kind of the thinking there. And I guess Catherine mentioned professional logging contractors in the Northeast was real involved in that. Do you have a question? Oh, sorry, Al, did you have something? Or we got a few minutes left. I just wanted to end with one thought before we break. And please feel free to raise your hand if you want to.
As you're pulling that out, I just wanted to say, that the session this morning, I don't know if any of you attended that on precision forestry, and some of those tools, when you're a large landowner, we have access to those in-house, we have the expertise, but we're hearing more and more they exist in the public domain. And that's, I think, one of the things that the roadmap and the advisory committee and the folks that are trying to continue to move that forward can think about is, how do we create a situation where the smaller landowners have the same advantage so that they can access those, so foresters working for them, or even, you know, maybe so that loggers have more flexibility? Because for us, one of the big advantages, you know, thinking about what you're asking, Dave, is we try to plan, so we have plan B and even a plan C if we need to. And sometimes you can jump a logger to another piece because it got too wet, and then you can come back and finish it. Well, if you're dealing with 100 acres or 20 acres, you don't have that option. But maybe if you had, you know, more information about the acreage around there, you could, and instead of forcing loggers to spend their time building that for themselves, you know, maybe some of these tools would help. So again, that's just brainstorming, I guess. So that in the brainstorming category.
And Chris, you've been a great ambassador for the roadmap, so I thought I'd just throw this up. And I think when we go down the hill, I believe it's wherever we go for the 3 o'clock session, Danny will be talking about that. But the roadmap was intended to give a 10-year vision to implement activities that will help grow strong Vermont forest product sector and a prosperous Vermont forest economy. I just want to touch on one point, which has to do with Pillar 2. One of the actions or the strategies is to enhance the capacity for industry adaptation. And so it's really exciting that in addition to some of the other funding advancements we've spoken about, our private lands manager, Keith Thompson, just got a $5.5 million grant from the U.S. Forest Service to help landowners, loggers, and foresters prepare and implement measures to adapt to the changing climate. And part of that will be funding for consulting foresters and loggers to implement climate smart forestry, climate adapted silviculture via sort of resiliency plans and resiliency measures, and then payments to both foresters and loggers for the cost of implementing those resiliency measures. And I think Ali from GM Extension will be involved in designing that sort of resiliency standard, and then we'll roll that out in trainings to loggers and consulting foresters who are interested, sort of give them an endorsement, which means they're kind of certified, and then they're eligible to apply for funding through what we're calling contract riders, where there'll be extra money to them via payments, direct payments, for those climate adaptation measures that are part of either a forest management plan or actually the logging practices on the ground. So that's really exciting, and that'll be rolling out. This is one of the other measures to help deal with these climate challenges that are coming down the pike. So we're just getting going on that, but feel free to reach out to me or Keith for more information, or Ali as we implement that. So thanks very much for joining. Let's give a round of applause to our 3 panelists.